Most people will spend their entire lives obeying a set of financial rules that were never designed to make them wealthy. They were designed to keep them working. And the most elegant part of this arrangement is that the people living inside it rarely suspect it exists. They believe that if they simply work harder, save a little more, and make a few wiser choices, the system will eventually reward them. But the system does not reward effort. It rewards ownership. And that single distinction, the gap between working and owning, is the first thing they never taught you. Benjamin Graham understood this more deeply than almost anyone who has ever written about money, and he understood it for a reason most people do not know. He did not begin his life on the comfortable side of this arrangement. His family lost nearly everything when he was a boy. His father died early, and his mother watched her savings vanish in a financial panic that the people who owned assets survived and the people who held only cash did not. Graham grew up watching the machinery of money from the bottom, and he spent the rest of his life reverse engineering exactly how it worked and why some people escape it while most never do. He clawed his way into Columbia University, built a fortune, lost much of it in the crash of 1929, and rebuilt it again using a set of principles he had refined in the hardest possible classroom, which is the experience of losing everything and being forced to understand precisely why. Today, I'm going to give you what he learned. 8 specific truths about how money actually behaves. Not motivational slogans, not vague encouragement, but structural realities that determine why most people remain exactly where they started, no matter how hard they work. This is not an attack on anyone. It is an explanation written for everyone the system simply never bothered to teach. Pay close attention, because each of these 8 will change the way you see the next dollar that passes through your hands. The first thing they never taught you is that poverty itself carries a hidden tax, one that quietly punishes you for not having money in the first place. It appears on no statement and is collected by no government, but it takes more from struggling people than any official tax ever could. Consider the brutal arithmetic Graham would have recognized instantly. 2 people want the same washing machine. The first has the cash and pays for it once. The second cannot pay up front, so buys it on an installment plan with interest, and over time pays half again as much for the identical machine. The same object, 2 prices, and the higher price is charged precisely to the person who could least afford it. This pattern repeats across every corner of a struggling person's life. They cannot buy in bulk, so they pay more per unit. They cannot wait for the right price, so they pay whatever the moment demands. They are forced to buy the cheap version of everything, the appliance that breaks, the car that constantly fails, and end up spending more across a decade than the person who could afford quality once. Being poor is, in the most literal mathematical sense, more expensive than being comfortable. But the deeper damage is not financial, it is cognitive. Researchers at Harvard, the economists Sendil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir, documented something both remarkable and disturbing. When a person is under severe financial stress, the mental bandwidth consumed by that stress measurably reduces their cognitive function by an amount equivalent to losing 13 points of IQ or to going an entire night without sleep. Think about what this means. The person who can least afford a financial mistake is forced to make their decisions with a mind operating at a deficit and survival mode, focused on the next 10 minutes rather than the next 10 years. This is not a character flaw, it is biology. And the way you break this trap is the most Graham-like idea imaginable. You build a margin of safety, not wealth, not investments, simply a small reserve, a buffer of a few $100s that stands between you and the next disaster. When that buffer exists, the panic quiets, the time horizon extends, and you can finally begin to think clearly. Before anything else, build the buffer. It is the foundation everything else rests upon. The second truth is one the school system actively works against, because it spends years installing the opposite belief. You are not paid for your effort. You are paid for your scarcity. Consider that a laborer in a mine works harder in a single day than most office workers do in a week, and is paid a fraction of what far less physically demanding work commands. The market does not measure sweat. It measures how difficult you are to replace. This is simply price and value applied to human labor, the same principle Graham applied to businesses. When supply is abundant, price collapses. If 1,000 people can do exactly what you do for exactly what you charge, you will always be paid the minimum required to keep you from leaving. The wealthy are taught to build what economists call a moat, a combination of skills so rare that no single replacement exists. You do not need to be the best in the world at any one thing. You need to be genuinely good at 2 or 3 things that rarely appear together, because the intersection of uncommon skills is where the market pays a premium and where your income finally begins to separate from your hours. Consider a person who is a competent writer, a competent designer, and who also understands how businesses actually make money. None of those 3 skills is rare on its own. Tens of thousands of people possess each one. But the person who holds all 3 at once becomes nearly impossible to replace, because the market is no longer comparing them to 1,000 identical candidates. It is comparing them to almost no one. That is how you build a moat. You stack rare enough abilities until the combination itself becomes rare. Here is the third, and it is where Graham's entire philosophy becomes deeply personal. It is the difference between an asset and a costume. Imagine 2 people who started with identical jobs and identical salaries. After 10 years, the first drives a new car, wears expensive clothing, and appears by every visible measure to be wealthy. The second drives an old sedan, lives modestly, and appears entirely ordinary. Yet, the first has a net worth near zero, weighed down by the debts taken on to maintain the appearance of success, while the second has quietly built a growing portfolio of productive assets. The difference is that the first person confused costumes with assets. Graham drew the cleanest possible line here. An asset is something that puts money into your pocket while you sleep. A liability is something that takes money out. A productive business that earns revenue without your presence is an asset. A depreciating object that demands insurance, maintenance, and fuel is a liability wearing the costume of wealth. The trap is not that people knowingly buy liabilities. It is that they buy them to feel wealthy, purchasing the emotion of success instead of its structure. The pleasure of buying a beautiful object is immediate and powerful. The pleasure of adding $100 to an index fund is almost non-existent. You cannot feel compounding. You cannot photograph it. But the person who chooses the invisible asset over the visible costume will eventually own something the other cannot buy back, which is freedom. After 20 years, one of them owns a closet of depreciated objects and the fading memory of impressing people who were never truly paying attention. The other owns time, options, and the rarest possession of all, the ability to say no. Stop buying costumes, begin buying assets, even small ones, especially the ones nobody notices. The fourth is a mechanism most people feel but cannot name, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It is how inflation actually works and whom it quietly serves. Most people understand inflation only as rising prices at the store. What they are never told is the mechanism underneath. When new money enters an economy, it does not arrive everywhere at once. It flows first into assets. Stock prices rise, real estate rises, the value of businesses rises, and the people who already own those things capture that increase before it ever reaches the street. Only later do consumer prices climb. And last of all, do wages adjust, because wages are slow and resisted and delayed. By the time a worker receives a modest raise, inflation has already consumed a larger share of their purchasing power. Understand the structural consequence of this. Every time the money supply expands, wealth is silently transferred from the people who hold cash and wages to the people who hold assets. The wealthy do not defeat inflation primarily through cleverness. They defeat it by standing on the correct side of the mechanism, by owning productive things. Graham's lesson here is direct. Move as quickly as you can from being a person who holds cash to being a person who holds assets. The asset need not be impressive. A low-cost fund that owns a broad slice of productive businesses is enough to capture the rise rather than be eroded by it. The engine of inflation that quietly destroys the saver nourishes the owner. This is why the person who keeps all of their money in a savings account, believing they are being responsible, is in fact slowly losing ground every single year, while the person who owns even a small slice of productive enterprise is quietly carried upward by the very same force. The fifth is the one almost everyone believes they understand and almost no one truly does. Compounding is not really about money. It is about time. People hear the words compound interest and nod, believing they understand. They do not, because if the full weight of it ever landed, they would behave completely differently. The formula has three parts: the amount you begin with, the rate at which it grows, and the length of time it runs. Most people obsess over the first two and ignore the third because time feels like waiting rather than strategy. But time is not merely one of the three factors. It is the one that compounds the others exponentially. A small amount invested early and left alone for 30 years becomes extraordinary. The same amount invested aggressively, but 10 years later becomes a fraction of that, because no rate of return can buy back the early years of the curve. This is why every year spent trapped in survival mode is not just a loss in the present. It is an exponential loss in the future, because the years you waste when you were young are the most powerful compounding years you will ever have. And there is a psychological dimension. Almost no one mentions the compounding curve is flat for a long time. For years, the number grows so slowly it feels like nothing is happening, while everyone around you spends visibly and lives larger. Most people cannot endure the flat part of the curve. They grow impatient, conclude the strategy has failed, and interrupt the process just before the acceleration begins. Charlie Munger said the first 100,000 is the hardest, and he was right, but not because of the mathematics. It is hard because you must build the discipline before the compounding becomes visible. You have to believe first and act on the belief before you see the evidence. Plant the tree and do not dig it up to check the roots. Let me make the arithmetic concrete, because Graham believed numbers should be felt rather than merely heard. Imagine two people who each set aside the same modest amount every month. The first begins at 25 and stops contributing entirely at 35, then simply leaves the money alone. The second does not begin until 35 and then contributes faithfully for the next 30 years. In most realistic scenarios, the first person who invested for only 10 years but started earlier ends up with more than the second, who invested for 3 times as long but started a decade later. The early years did the work that no amount of later effort could replicate. That is the exponent of time, and it is the single most expensive thing the poor are never taught to value while they still have the most of it to spend. The sixth is written directly into the law, and you were never the intended reader. The tax code was built for owners, not for workers. The distinction Graham would draw is simple and worth holding on to. Money that you work for is treated by the law far more harshly than money that works for you. Nearly every major economy divides income into 2 categories. The first is the money you earn by selling your time, your wages, and salary, and it is taxed at the highest rates, often before it even reaches your account. The second is the money generated by assets you own, dividends and capital gains, and it is taxed at significantly lower rates. The stated reason is that investment drives growth, so capital is rewarded more generously than labor. You may agree or disagree, but it does not change the arithmetic. If you earn your living by selling hours, the system takes the largest possible share. If you earn it by owning productive assets, the system takes less. The wealthy do not necessarily abandon earned income, especially at the start, but they work relentlessly to shift the proportion of their income from labor toward ownership, from wages toward dividends. The poor are taught to file their taxes and pay what they owe. The fortunate are taught to understand the structure and to position themselves entirely within the law on the side it was built to favor. Every dollar you shift from labor income to ownership income is taxed more gently and compounds more freely. Learn the code. It was written for someone. Make sure that someone is you. The seventh has nothing to do with money directly, and yet it quietly governs everything else. Your environment calibrates what your own mind considers normal. You have likely heard that you become the average of the people you spend the most time with, and most dismiss it as decoration. But there is genuine reason behind it. The human brain continuously adjusts its sense of what is normal and possible based on its surroundings. If everyone around you treats poverty as permanent, ambition as arrogance, and wealth as luck, your mind will quietly adopt those same boundaries and hold your behavior within them. When you begin to rise, when you save instead of spend and invest instead of consume, the people around you will sense the shift, and many will resist it because your discipline makes their lack of it visible. This is not cruelty. It is instinct, the unconscious pull of a group toward its own equilibrium. You cannot and should not abandon everyone you know, but you must deliberately build a second environment, a mental neighborhood of people operating at the level you are moving toward. And here is the part that matters most for someone starting with nothing. You do not need wealth to enter that environment. You need a library card, a pair of headphones, and attention. When you read the words of a great investor or thinker, you are spending time inside their mind, absorbing their operating system, recalibrating your sense of what is possible. Graham did exactly this. He surrounded himself with the thinking of people who saw further than those around him. Choose those voices with the same care you would choose an investment, because they compound just as powerfully. And the eighth, the one that ties all the others together, is that wealth is not a number, it is a system, and a system must be built. Most people imagine wealth as an amount, a figure in an account they hope to reach and then hold. This is why so many who suddenly receive money lose it within a few years. The money was never the real thing. The real thing is the system that produces the money, and a system cannot be handed to you. It can only be constructed. A person who earns a large income but spends all of it has income and no system. The moment the income stops, everything stops. A person with a modest income who consistently directs a portion of it into productive assets is building a second engine, one that runs quietly in the background, small and almost invisible at first, but growing year after year until it eventually produces enough to cover the basics of life without any additional labor. That moment when the system runs without you is the true definition of financial independence, not the moment you reach a particular number. The architecture is simple to describe and difficult to build. A defensive layer of savings and eliminated debt that protects the whole structure from a single catastrophe. The patient redirection of earned income into productive assets, beginning small. Because for most people, it must begin small. Structural leverage, the building of things that produce value without demanding your constant presence. And finally, time, which cannot be rushed and can only be respected, each year adding silent, invisible progress that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. So let me gather all eight together before I close. Poverty carries a hidden tax that punishes you for having nothing, and you break it by building a buffer that restores your ability to think clearly. The market pays for scarcity, not effort, so build a rare combination of skills that makes you hard to replace. Assets put money into your pocket while liabilities take it out, so stop buying costumes and start acquiring structures that generate. Inflation transfers wealth from savers to owners, so become an owner of productive assets, even in small quantities. Time is the force that makes compounding exponential, so begin now and give it the one thing it cannot function without. The tax code favors owners, so position yourself on the side it was designed to reward. Your environment shapes what your mind believes is possible, so choose your intellectual surroundings as carefully as your investment. And wealth is not a number, but a system built component by component and given the time it needs to run. Here is the final truth, and it is the one Graham proved with his own life rather than merely teaching it. None of these eight are secrets hidden away in vaults. None require luck or connections or money you do not yet have. They are simply structural facts about how money behaves. And the reason most people never learn them has nothing to do with conspiracy. The wealthy child absorbs these ideas at the dinner table, in the offhand remarks of financially literate parents, in an environment where the machinery of money is discussed as casually as the weather. The struggling child grows up where that conversation never happens, not because anyone hid it, but because no one in the room had ever heard it either. Knowledge that is never spoken simply does not pass on. That is the entire mechanism, and it is quieter and more ordinary than any villain you might imagine. But Graham is the proof that the mechanism can be broken. He began with nothing. In a family the system had already ground down and moved past. He was not the wealthiest investor of his century, nor the most naturally gifted. He was simply the one who refused to keep playing by rules he had taken the time to understand, and who chose, in decision after decision across a lifetime, to stand on the side of ownership rather than labor. What separated him from the people he grew up among was not talent, it was knowledge learned and then acted upon before too many of his years were spent. You now hold that same knowledge. The machinery has not changed since Graham first mapped it. The only variable left undecided is you and the time you still have to put what you have learned to work. Begin today, while the most powerful compounding years you will ever own are still ahead of you and not behind you. Spend them deliberately, spend them patiently, and spend them in every decision you make from this moment forward on the side of ownership. That was the whole of Graham's secret. It always was.